On a bleak January morning in 1649, Charles, the King of England, was led from the cold halls of St. James's Palace toward his final judgment, a black scaffold looming outside the frost-bitten expanse of Whitehall. The air was heavy with the silence of a nation exhausted by war, every footstep echoing in corridors where once courtiers whispered of power and destiny. Above him, painted ceilings immortalized the faces of kings gone before his father James I, gazing down from a realm beyond, a silent witness to the fall of a dynasty. Charles walked beneath those ancestral eyes, haunted by the knowledge that soon he too would become only a memory in the painted vaults of history. Winter clung to the city so bitter that the king, unwilling to appear weak before those who had judged him, wore 2 coats, determined not to let shivers betray him to the crowd. "It is so cold this season that it makes me shiver," he once remarked, which some observers might have imagined was due to fear. The words were a final shield, deflecting any suspicion that the king could be undone by anything but fate itself. The road to Whitehall was lined not with loyal subjects, but with silent watchers, faces blurred and emotionless in the morning haze. The Parliament's justice embodied in the faceless judges and the cold, impassive soldiers had replaced the warmth of loyalty with the chill of accusation. As Charles mounted the scaffold, a hush deeper than any prayer settled over the crowd. His executioners, respectful yet hidden behind veils, became the living symbols of a nation unable to confront its own act of regicide. "Why are you veiled?" he asked them, voice steady against the biting wind. "Gentlemen, are you afraid to kill your king with your face uncovered?" His question floated unanswered, merging with the slow tolling of distant church bells, a sound both mournful and relentless, tolling for a world about to pass into shadow. Refusing to let even the smallest indignity mar this final tableau, Charles pointed to his neck and addressed the executioner once more. "Does my long hair bother you?" The answer, when it came, was brief and clinical. Yes, it would be better if his neck were uncovered. Resigned, the king drew on a plain nightcap, and the executioner's hands, impersonal and practiced, tucked his hair beneath the cloth. The gesture, so simple, so final, stripped away the last remnants of regal splendor, leaving only a man at the mercy of his fate. Above them, the crown lay discarded, its absence a silent testament to the collapse of a world, while the sword of justice seemed to hang invisible and omnipresent between the king and his assembled judges. With his hair squared away, Charles turned at last to the gathered crowd, his figure cast long and thin by the pallid winter light. Every face before him seemed blank, unreadable, a nation's gaze emptied of hope or hate, only the quiet reckoning of a people bound by history and loss. In that frozen moment, as snow crunched underfoot and the last echoes of the bells drifted across Whitehall, the king prepared to speak his voice, carrying not only the weight of his own dignity, but the unspoken grief of an era passing into silence. But now his words were lost to the air, swallowed by the cold silence that hung over Whitehall. Only the hooded executioners, their faces hidden and hearts unreadable, could catch the faint cadence of the king's final address. When his speech faded into the bleak morning, Charles turned with a quiet composure toward the masked axemen. "Permit me, sir, to say a few prayers, and when I stretch out my arms, like so you may strike." His voice, though soft, bore the remnants of royal authority, a final command spoken to the man who now embodied the fate of the realm. With dignified resolve, Charles knelt and rested his head upon the block, shutting his eyes against the relentless winter glare. He began to pray, words uttered not for the multitude, but for the unseen heavens, a dialogue of soul and conscience carried out in the hush before destiny's arrival. As the executioner approached, the chill air seemed to tighten around the scaffold. In his preparation, the man's axe brushed Charles's shoulder, a clumsy, accidental touch, yet enough to stir the king from prayer. Charles, mistaking the contact for the signals, calmly reminded his executioner to wait for the agreed sign. It was a final gesture of self-possession, a testament to the unyielding sense of dignity that clung to him even as history closed in. The axeman relented, and the king, his faith unbroken, returned to prayer. After a few solemn moments, Charles outstretched his arms, surrendering to the ritual that would sever a bloodline and with it the order of centuries. What followed was not the roar of a crowd or the triumph of justice, but an echoing groan, a wave of disbelief that swept through the thousands gathered as if the soul of England itself had shuddered beneath the weight of its own decision. An eyewitness named Roger recalled that the sound was like none he had ever heard, nor wished to hear again a universal moan torn from the fabric of the nation. Even Edward Hyde, a bitter critic, confessed that the collective sigh seemed to shake the very world, as if creation itself recoiled at the moment a king fell. The death of Charles was no mere political reckoning. It was an unraveling of sacred belief. To see a king once crowned in the certainty of divine right struck down before the multitude was to witness the breaking of an ancient covenant, a martyrdom in the eyes of some, a sacrilege to others. The crowd, frozen beneath the iron winter sky, sensed that the world had shifted irrevocably. Where once the king's word echoed with the weight of God, now only silence remained chilling as the snow underfoot. The monarchy had not merely been dethroned, but dismembered from the soul of its people. Such a shock demanded an answer. How had England come to this precipice, to the unthinkable spectacle of regal execution? What chain of betrayal, disappointment, and destiny had drawn Charles to this hour, and what truths lingered unspoken within his final words? To seek understanding, one must return decades to the unlikely moment when Charles became heir. His brother Henry, praised for his brilliance and vigor, had been the kingdom's hope, but death claimed him early, leaving Charles, a timid, frail boy of 12, cursed by shyness and a stammer as the unexpected successor. When James I died in 1625, Charles, only 24, and weighed by the shadow of his father's rule, took up the crown. He was not the king England had anticipated, nor the one they desired. Yet by the ancient doctrine of divine right, his frailties did not matter. The very institution of monarchy sanctified him, declaring that through blood and ceremony, the hand of heaven rested upon his brow. His stammer was irrelevant. His word for a time was still the will of God. Yet on that frigid morning at Whitehall, the discarded crown lay invisible in the snow. The sword of justice glinted cold above the block, and the blank, silent faces of the judges bore witness to the final reckoning. And so the last king of England in that long, sacred line surrendered not just his life, but the myth that once shielded him, a myth shattered in the cold winter light, leaving only questions echoing like distant bells unanswered in the hearts of a nation. It was this unyielding conviction in the divine right of kings that cast the first shadow over Charles II's reign, a belief that would fracture the realm and lead inexorably toward his ruin. From the outset, the new king summoned Parliament seeking their consent to raise taxes for another distant war, this time against Spain. When Parliament refused, the old order began to unravel. What followed was not merely disagreement, but a relentless battle for supremacy. Over the next 4 years, every council, every debate became a new battlefield. King and Parliament clashed bitterly, their trust eroding with each confrontation until the very idea of authority itself seemed brittle and imperiled. With his power constrained and his coffers empty, Charles turned to the nobility for support. He demanded vast loans from the great families of England. When they hesitated, he responded with imprisonment, an act both unlawful and deeply resented by Parliament. These heavy-handed measures only tightened the noose around his throne, and Parliament, alarmed by his overreach, moved to curtail the king's authority, their faces cold and resolute as marble judges. In 1629, the king, wearied by defiance and desperate to reassert his will, dismissed Parliament altogether. With a sweep of the royal hand, he banished the voices of the realm, determined to rule alone. But the long years that followed brought little triumph. England entered a period of uneasy, quiet 11 winters, marked by suspicion and silent dissent, as the crown seemed to grow heavier and the court colder. The nation itself shivered, riven by unspoken grievances. Far to the north, a storm was gathering. Complicated disputes and wounded pride led Charles into religious conflict with Scotland, a struggle that soon left him humbled and nearly destitute. Scottish armies pressed into England. Humiliation and the biting winds of defeat forced the king to return to Parliament, this time as a supplicant. Yet time had not softened those who had once been silenced. Parliament, kept waiting for a decade, now met the king's plea with a list of grievances as cold and inexorable as the winter itself. The grand remonstrance, a litany of more than 200 accusations, stripped the royal image to its bones, exposing every fault, every slight. Charles felt the world slipping from his grasp, the crown growing ever more distant, a symbol of power now tarnished by suspicion and resentment. Unable to endure such humiliation, he lashed out in desperation. Early in 1642, he marched into the House of Commons with armed men at his side, intent on seizing 5 members accused of treason. But the chamber was empty of his targets. The warning had come, the birds had flown. He spoke into the hollow air. "I see all the birds are flown," his words echoing against walls that had once bowed before him. It was a fatal misstep. At that moment, Parliament and the City of London united in their opposition. The mask of royal authority cracked, and the ancient sword of justice was raised, not in his defense, but against him. Parliament seized control of the army, and Charles, now truly isolated, withdrew to Nottingham, where he lifted his own standard in the bleak wind and called for loyal subjects to rally. The clash of principle and pride, faith and fear, had reached its inevitable crescendo. Political discord gave way to open war, and the kingdom descended into chaos. A nation split by old allegiances and new betrayals, the cold of winter presaging the long darkness to come. The English Civil War cast its shadow over a battered nation for more than a decade, leaving behind the haunted silence of fields where the fallen numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It remains the bloodiest conflict to ever stain English soil, an era when the kingdom itself was cleaved apart, one side, grasping for the fading authority of the crown, the other wielding the banner of Parliament. The clash of visions, the echo of musket fire, and the march of men like Cromwell and Fairfax tore England's heart in two. Parliament's armies, forged in the furnace of conviction and necessity, claimed a bitter victory. Yet for Charles, sovereign by birthright and belief, defeat was only the beginning of a deeper isolation. When hope faltered, the king fled, seeking refuge first with Scottish allies. But in the turning of fortunes that marked his reign, those same protectors delivered him, as if in silent judgment, into Parliament's grasp. Forced into negotiations, Charles wore the mask of compliance, nodding and smiling, feigning acceptance of Parliament's modest reforms that merely sought to place a mortal boundary on his royal power. Behind closed doors, however, his mind remained restless, crafting pleas and secret promises to Scotland. He courted betrayal as a desperate remedy, inviting the Scots to strike England, in his name offering religious concessions and treasures to purchase one more hope. Scotland answered, and for a second time the land was soaked with strife, as Parliament confronted not only domestic rebellion, but foreign arms brought at the king's own behest. This second conflict, brief yet costly, ended swiftly, with the king's allies defeated. The truth was laid bare. Charles would rather call on the sword of strangers than yield the divine certainty of his throne. Even as Parliament's patience frayed and their coffers emptied, the king's refusal to concede became a silent frost between him and the world he once ruled. His captors, uncertain, divided, debated what fate might suit a monarch who had become both symbol and problem. From the shadows of this confusion rose Oliver Cromwell, cold and resolute. In the winter of 1648, he purged Parliament itself, stripping away any voice that might defend the king, leaving only those determined to judge. This new assembly, soon named the Rump Parliament, bent not to tradition, but to the relentless logic of the age. With the crown now a discarded relic and the sword of justice raised high, Cromwell's faction pressed forward the unthinkable, a trial for the king. The idea chilled the soul of England for centuries, had taught that a king ruled by the will of God, his authority beyond the reckoning of mere mortals. To put Charles on trial under common law was as strange as the church putting God himself in the dock. Even those who had taken up arms against the crown had once comforted themselves with the fiction that they fought the king's evil advisers, not the king himself. But this moment, this courtroom shattered those illusions. Here Charles would be judged not as a distant sovereign, but as a man weighed by those once counted as his subjects. In the cold, echoing vault of Westminster Hall on a January morning in 1649, Charles appeared not as a ruler, but as the accused. The faces of his judges were blank and implacable, Parliament's chosen, presided over by John Bradshaw. The air in the hall was heavy with centuries of expectation and betrayal, the winter light filtering through tall windows like the cold gaze of history itself. Alone, surrounded by the silence of those who would unmake him, Charles entered the final chapter of his reign, a king yet utterly alone beneath the judgment of a nation divided by his very name. As Charles entered the hall, a cold and echoing vastness pressed in from every side, the air thick with anticipation. The assembled crowd, a tide of restless humanity, filled the chamber with a muffled roar that ebbed and swelled beneath the vaulted ceiling, their faces indistinct like a living sea that had come not to celebrate, but to bear witness to the undoing of a king. In that frozen January light, every voice seemed strained, every movement heavy with the knowledge that history itself had gathered to render judgment. Those who addressed the court were forced to shout, straining their voices just to be heard above the relentless murmur, yet even their proclamations seemed to vanish into the cold, echoing emptiness. Charles took his place before the stern bench of judges, his features marked by a composure that belied the tremors beneath. The charges were read: treason, violence, wicked designs against the peace of the realm, all pronounced with the mechanical certainty of fate. Charles Stuart, King of England, you stand here on trial for high treason, levying war against the kingdom, rapine, violence, wicked designs, and evil practices against the liberty and peace of the kingdom, and a traitor. As these words filled the hall, a faint sharp laugh escaped the king, a sudden fissure in the solemnity, the briefest protest against the absurdity that a sovereign could be accused of betraying the very body of law he embodied. To Charles, the logic twisted upon itself by tradition. Only violence against the crown could be treason, yet he was the crown. How could the river turn against its own source? Yet the new order gathering in the cold hall believed otherwise. The blank faces of Parliament's judges, untouched by empathy, were resolute in their belief that power belonged not to birthright, but to the will of the people. The sword of justice, now raised, no longer weighed only by royal hands. In this court, the divine right of kings, which had once crowned Charles's brow with unquestioned authority, had been cast aside and lay forgotten in the shadowy corners. Here the notion of popular sovereignty loomed, each blank stare a silent challenge to centuries of inherited rule, each distant church bell a toll for the passing of an old world. The proceedings pressed on. Charges that seemed like riddles to the king were read and read again, each repetition a hammer blow upon the fading notion of royal infallibility. Judge Bradshaw's voice cut through the tension. "Sir, you have heard the charges against you. How do you plead?" Charles did not answer as they wished. Instead, with all the gravity of a monarch surrounded by traitors and strangers, he replied, "I will answer you, but first I must ask. There are many unlawful authorities in this world, such as brigands on the highway. But I would ask, by what lawful authority am I brought here, and by what lawful authority do you presume to sit in judgment of me?" The king's words poised and sharp as the winter air momentarily unsettled the cold certainty of the hall. It was a subtle defiance rooted in ancient law. An English king, by the logic of his own courts, could not be tried under his own law. The very foundation of judgment crumbled at the edges, yet the faces of the court remained impassive, their silence deeper than the winter itself. Beneath the weight of those silent stares and the endless tolling of distant bells, Charles understood the finality of his isolation. The world he had ruled as a matter of right was slipping away. The crown discarded the sword of justice, suspended by unfamiliar hands. In that great cold hall, with the nation's eyes upon him, he became both king and captive, bearing alone the sorrow of a house, divided the ruinous burden of a nation torn by civil war, and the knowledge that the past was closing behind him like the snows of winter, inexorable and cold. So with the heavy doors of the court closing behind him, Charles found himself cast into the frigid glare of judgment, a monarch stripped of retinue facing the relentless machinery of Parliament, assembled not for homage, but for trial. Each echoing step in the chamber resounded with centuries of certainty now shattered. By summoning a king before their bench, Parliament was trespassing into forbidden territory. The old order recoiled at the sight, yet the gavel fell indifferent to royal lineage or sacred blood. Charles stood beneath the pallid glow of winter's light, his presence defiant, the memory of his crown hanging like a shadow over the proceedings. He demanded, as only a sovereign could, by what right these men dared summon their king, but his question drifted unanswered in the frost-laden air. Bradshaw, masked in authority and grim purpose, replied, "Only it is not for the prisoner to question the court." Yet Charles would not yield. "I am no ordinary prisoner. No earthly power can call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent." The ritual of power and protest danced on a battle not of swords but of silence and words, the old world against the new. For the court to advance, the accused must answer. But Charles would not bow, would not plead, for even in the face of this cold tribunal, he clung to the remnants of dignity, the echo of divinity that had once crowned him. He was painfully aware that beneath English law, a defendant refusing to plead could face unspeakable torments, but even in these dark hours, he knew Parliament would not risk the spectacle of royal suffering. His resistance was not mere stubbornness, but a shrewd turning of the tables. For all the banners raised in the name of justice and liberty, Parliament now stood exposed, accused by their own captive king of lawlessness, of tyranny, cloaked as reform. He warned the court that if unchecked power could invent its own law, no subject in England, neither free nor noble, could ever feel safe. The very chamber grew heavier as these words settled, as if the stones themselves mourned the passing of old certainties. The crown lay discarded in memory, the sword of justice raised instead above the king himself. With each refusal, Charles forced the court's hand. The threat of contempt hovered, plead or be silenced. Tried in absence, a king denied even the dignity of his own defense. Yet still he would not submit. The judges' faces were cold and blank, indifferent to the struggles playing out within the man before them. In that silence, Charles was more alone than ever, a king encircled, condemned not only by his enemies, but by the turning tide of history. At last, the guards closed in. As Charles was led from the hall, the air seemed to crystallize around him. Through the gloom, a single member of the crowd surged forward, breaking the icy stillness to spit upon the king's face. The insult clung for a moment before Charles, ever composed, wiped it away with a handkerchief, murmuring so that all who stood nearby would hear, "Well, Sir God hath justice in store for you and I." The moment hung suspended between old dignity and new disdain before the king was swallowed by the passageways of Whitehall once more. In the wake of his removal, the proceedings staggered forward. Over the next 2 days, witnesses emerged, common men with calloused hands. Butchers, bakers, and carpenters summoned to speak judgment against one who had ruled as God's anointed. The symbolism was unmistakable. The very people whose obedience had once formed the bedrock of monarchy now raised their voices against it, and the great engine of the Civil War thundered on in the testimonies of the ordinary. Throughout the cold never lifted, nor did the tension. The distant bells rang on, and the crown, once so dazzling, seemed now only a memory lost in the snow. At last, the verdict arrived. The king was found guilty, and within Parliament itself, uncertainty brewed. Many could stomach no harsher fate than abdication, or the transformation of the crown into little more than a constitutional relic. But the weight of judgment hung in the air, inescapable, as the closing of an age drew near, and the silence of winter pressed in, promising that nothing, no crown, no law, no king could remain untouched by the storm that had been unleashed. Behind the heavy wooden doors of Parliament, the air was thick with whispered bargains and unseen threats. Cromwell and his cohort moved like shadows, exerting pressure on wavering minds, gathering by force of will coin and intimidation the barest majority needed to seal the fate of a monarch. In the end, only 59 signatures stained the parchment that would become the king's death, warrant each name an echo of a nation at war with itself. On the 27th of January, just a week after the trial's grim theater began, Charles was summoned back into the courtroom to receive his sentence. The chamber, once a place of royal pronouncements and reverence, now pulsed with an icy expectancy. The crown, unseen but palpable, lay discarded, replaced by the silent accusation of the assembled judges, their faces a blank tribunal of history itself. Before the sentence was pronounced, Charles was offered a last chance to speak. He asked with the controlled dignity that remained to him whether a true Parliament, one including both the Lords and Commons, might yet be assembled to judge his case. The answer was a flat and final refusal, and the decree was spoken aloud. Charles Stuart, declared a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and enemy of the people, would die by the severing of his head. The words fell in the cold silence, but the king's resolve did not break. He tried once more to address Judge Bradshaw, seeking a few moments to plead, to broker some last compromise for his life. But the judge silenced him without emotion. "You are not to be heard after sentence." As soldiers moved to remove him from the chamber, Charles's voice lingered, a final, desperate appeal to reason and mercy. "Won't you hear a word, sir?" The reply was as unmoved as the winter air. It would make no difference. The fate of the king was already sealed, the sword of justice poised above him, history closing like a fist. His execution was fixed for the 30th of January, and Charles was led not to a dungeon, but to St. James's Palace. There, under a gentler captivity, he was given 3 days to confront his mortality, while builders outside raised the scaffold at Whitehall, hidden from the king's view so that his nights would not be haunted by the sound of hammers. Within those walls, the last fragments of his life gathered around him. He wrote to his eldest son, pressing into the page, the lonely wisdom of a man forced to relinquish not just power, but legacy. On the eve of his death, he was allowed to see his youngest children, Elizabeth and Henry. In that cold chamber stripped of all regal authority, Charles became simply a father holding his weeping daughter, unable to console her with words or presence. The final embrace lingered in the air as the children were led away, each step a fracture in the king's resolve. When the door closed behind them, the mask of royal composure shattered. He crumpled to the floor, lost in silent, wrenching grief. He would spend the remainder of that day alone, his thoughts circling through memory, regret, and a faith that seemed battered by betrayal. The next morning, January 30th, Charles awoke before dawn. The heavy winter dark pressed at the windows as he quietly declared, "I have great work to do today." He requested an extra shirt, determined that the chill would not betray him before the crowd. He ate a meager breakfast, bread and wine, and by the hour of 10, soldiers escorted him through silent corridors toward Whitehall. Outside, the city was transformed. The scaffold stood stark beneath a sky of iron, ringed with soldiers, the crowd a restless ocean, held back by fear and uncertainty. Parliament had filled the square with armed men, wary that sympathy or anger might erupt into chaos, determined that history's course would not be diverted at the final hour. No names would be given for the masked executioners who awaited him. Their faces were hidden, their identities sealed, their hands well rewarded for their grim task. The ritual unfolded with the inexorable weight of fate, the discarded crown, the raised sword of justice, the impassive faces, the winter cold settling into the stones beneath their feet. Each detail, each breath was heavy with the finality of a world closing in on a solitary king, while the echoes of war and judgment rippled through the silence, tolling with every distant bell. Upon the frozen scaffold Charles Thirst stood, beneath the bleak winter sky, his figure solitary against the black timber. The air hung thick with judgment, and as he turned to address the assembled crowd, the cold light caught his features, lending them a spectral pallor. His voice, steady yet heavy with the weight of all that had come before, reached out into the silence. He spoke not in accusation, but with a somber calm, offering forgiveness to the world, and more quietly to those whose hidden hands had brought him to this end. "God knows who they are," he intoned. "I do not desire to know. God forgive them." His words were not the wrathful decrees of a sovereign, but a final measured plea for grace, spoken by a king now stripped of his power, casting aside the earthly crown for the incorruptible one he believed awaited beyond mortal judgment. The king's gaze moved over the masses, their faces blurred and unreadable, some cold with triumph, others grave with uncertainty. He declared that he had always wished for their liberty and freedom, but reminded them that such things lay not in chaotic rule, but in the shelter of law and governance. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. He pronounced each word ringing out into the chill, as if to underscore the irrevocable boundary between ruler and ruled. There was dignity here, the fragile dignity of a man accepting his fate, the composure of royalty facing the final tolling of the bell. The crowd listened hushed as the king, framed by the distant echo of church bells and the ghostly silence of winter, concluded, "With this I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown where no disturbance can be." With ritual solemnity, Charles knelt upon the block, bowing his head, not just to the executioner, but to the weight of history itself. His lips moved in silent prayer, the breath of his final words vanishing in the frozen air. All around him, the raised sword of justice seemed to hover unseen, the unspoken judgment of blank-faced witnesses and hidden accusers pressing down on him with a force greater than steel. No cry rang out. Only the hush of the waiting crowd and the distant bell marked the moment. It is told that when all was done, an executioner lifted the severed head and pronounced, "Behold the head of a traitor." Yet the anonymity and silence of those charged with this act suggest that even here truth and legend blur the faces of the executioners, as obscured as the motives that ended the king's reign. In the vacuum left by the fallen crown, Oliver Cromwell would ascend his shadow cast long over England, yet the monarchy's memory would linger waiting to reclaim its place in history. Charles's memory is divided as fractured as the realm he once ruled. He began his reign beset by uncertainty, hindered by a stammer, and unable to wield charisma with the ease expected of kings. His rule was marked by rash decisions, fierce pride, and a disregard for England's ancient laws, bringing civil war and a suffering greater than any in living memory. Yet in the final reckoning, something changed. In the courtroom, his voice found clarity and calm. His demeanor became measured and philosophical, and at the scaffold he showed a grace and restraint that even his enemies could not ignore. He treated both executioners and accusers with a strange, almost regal courtesy, a king accepting his end with a dignity that would haunt those who witnessed it. In the end, perhaps every king wears two faces pressed together beneath the cold weight of the crown, one shaped by pride and error, the other revealed in the shadow of fate. And as the sword of justice falls and the last bell rings, it is this duality that endures, echoing through history, a reminder that the true cost of sovereignty is measured not only in power, but in the lonely reckoning of a man standing at the end, stripped bare beneath the winter sky.